we go any further, there are a couple of things I need to, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize these things. So first of all of us, when we wake up in the morning, we have to recognize a few things. One is that the land that we're standing on comes from Native Americans, right? So we have to understand that as a context, that every morning that we wake up, the conquered people that originally held this land were American Indians. So that's important. What else is important to recognize is that we all have privilege and power. That we all have privilege and power, right? So when I think about my own self, I'm 6'2". I'm African American. I don't have a felony. I have matriculated through higher education. I am mildly attractive and extremely humble.
That's very funny.
So some of those privileges I can access that actually give me power. And power we'll define as the ability to get things done, right? So I can use some of my privileges to access power. Some of those privileges I was born with, and others of those privileges I acquired myself. And so again, we would be remiss if we did not recognize our own privilege and power, because if we don't recognize that, then it can become a weapon for and towards other people. So I recognize the fact that being a heterosexual male or I present as a kind of stereotypical cisgendered heterosexual male who has the ability to get married, right? So we recognize that doesn't happen in all 50 states, that people have that as a resource. So I have to be mindful of my own privilege and power so that I don't say, well, why aren't you talking about your family the way I talk about my family? Maybe they're not in a situation where they can do that, right? And also recognizing that I can't use my worldview as the worldview to measure everything else, that I have to set my worldview alongside of others' worldviews. And we'll talk a little bit about that once we get into the presentation. So I do want us to recognize that we all have privilege and power. And it's not so much having it that should concern us as much as what do we do with that privilege and power, right? And so I want you to think about in what ways do you have privilege, in what ways do you have power, and then how do you use that? And we'll talk a little bit later. We'll get into some more conversation opportunities around those thoughts. And so right now, I'm just wondering, can you see my slide on the screen? Okay, great. So I'm going to advance that. I'm also going to turn on the closed captions, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen, hopefully. In case the audio cuts out or whatever, you can still follow along with words. And I did ask Michelle if she could preserve this part of the conversation for me so that I can learn more about how well I did in this presentation and reflect on it. So I did ask her to do that on my behalf. So let me just go into my slide deck really quick. I'm going to minimize our chat room. And there's three of us that have been working on this project with our own staff around talking about this, how we're dealing and coping with COVID-19 and how to COVID-19, and then how do we become allies? And so Laura Lee is my director. I'm the program director, and then Ali Braswell is in Florida, guiding our work there. We don't need to necessarily go over these things. This is kind of our statement that all of for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Mayo Clinic will be recognized by patients and employees and peer institutions and the community as a leading model for diversity and inclusion. And that's kind of how we go about doing that in that circle. But for our conversation, this is kind of where we've started conversations about how to deal with this. So as we work to control the spread of COVID-19, we must also control the spread of hate during this pandemic. And what we've recognized is that there's been a lot of scapegoating that has happened towards our Asian American colleagues, both inside and outside of spheres that we control. And so what we've noticed is that this has been something that's been ramping up, that's been accumulating. And we even, we hear it from some of the highest political offices that, this particular disease is should be associated with a particular country or a particular group of people, when we know that this is a human disease, right? And so have you seen any of these types of incidences in your local community, and how have people addressed them or make comments about them? So I'm curious to hear what you've experienced.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I live in a city outside of Chicago. It's a suburb. We're about 40 minutes outside, so predominantly white. But we do have some, some diversity here, just not as much as in a lot of the communities that surround us. And there was a Chinese American doctor, physician, who was out running on a trail and who was attacked while he was running on the trail and verbally assaulted, and they threw things at him. Again, some in line with some of the things that are on the screen here. So very unfortunate. And then just the community response to if you read through the comments on the article that was written up about it, really disappointing to see a lot of those. Lots of allies, but lots of people that are, not helping the conversation, I think.
Yeah. Other folks, I'll give a couple more minutes. Okay, cool. We'll move on. And so this doesn't seem to be an anomaly, particularly here in the United States, right? During the AIDS epidemic, who do we blame for those things?
The LGBTQ community.
Yeah, right. So. When MERS happened and when the so-called swine flu, we look for scapegoats. And why do we look for scapegoats?
I think it's easier to have someone to put that blame on to make us feel better about ourselves. I think that being able to place that, even though it's misplaced or not, but being able to place it somewhere, kind of put it in a box, if you will, helps us cope better, I think.
Yeah. Other folks, what do you think? Why do we need a scapegoat?
I definitely think that's about right. We as humans want to make sense of things, and in the case of something so senseless as a pandemic that's, unpredictable and scary, it's easy for us to find something very controllable that we can get scared or angry about.
Yeah, we have to have something that we can see, right? And we have to for whatever, for our psychology, we can't see these germs, but if we can manifest that into some way that we can, right, wrong, or otherwise. But I think that's that's part of the psychology of where we are, right? And so there become these three pieces that we should consider, particularly when we're engaging in this conversation. And that's fear, stigma, and ethnocentrism, right? And so, so what do you think is at the root of fear? What is at the root of fear?
Understanding, or, the perspective of their understanding. You just don't know enough. You don't know about the other perspective enough that you feel fearful of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with that. I would say unknown, not lack of understanding, all that kind of, anything that we don't understand or know about, we tend to fear.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say that too, different, right?
Different, yeah, that's a good word. Different is good.
Yeah, and I would go as far as to say that even that the root of fear may not necessarily be the fear itself, but it's the ambiguity that produces fear, right? So when I'm not sure about a thing, when I don't know about a thing, when I'm not, then that psychological that psychological mechanism of ambiguity produces this fear, right? And so the more we know, the more we can reduce fear, right? We also know that stigma is related to fear because it gives us this so-called enemy to engage with, right? So so let's talk a little bit about those two things, and then we'll get into some other stuff. So sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Anyone ever heard that?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, right? What do we know about that?
Words do hurt.
That is BS.
Yeah,
It's not true.
Words hurt.
Somebody said that's BS. Yeah, go ahead.
We were raised that way, and we all grew up learning that and kind of living by that, that biased opinion. But the truth of the matter is, words hurt. We can pretend as adults like I'm unbothered or unfazed, but the truth is, in your quiet time, when you're washing dishes or figuring out what you're going to eat for dinner, you're going to think back to what that person said in that meeting, how burned up you were.
That's true. Right. I mean, there are something, and I'm sure we figured this out, that there are some things that we should never say because we can't take them back. Right. Yeah. So yeah, sticks and stones. That was a great thing to kind of try to build resilience, but it wasn't very accurate. Right. And so stigma is really about this set of unfair beliefs that are typically perpetrated by the uninformed or having a little bit of knowledge about a thing. Right. And it is projected onto something or someone. And so when we think about this fear, there are a number of different kinds of fears, but the one we want to speak specifically to is this xenophobia, this fear of the other. And again, going back to my previous statement, I think this so-called fear is actually a response to ambiguity, like not knowing what is going to happen. So we fill in the gaps, we create the pictures ourselves. And so when we think about ethnocentrism, what do you see is happening in this particular diagram, where the person is looking at this image on the floor, and one person sees a 6 and the other person sees a 9? How does this relate to ethnocentrism?
It's from their point of view.
Yeah.
You think that
Perception.
Yep.
So perception, people seeing things from their point of view.
It's not that they're coming at this from like a bad faith place or like lying. It's just that they're seeing what they see, and what they see is very different than what someone else sees.
Yeah. So
Their experiences.
So their experiences, right?
and their assumption that those experiences equal correctness somehow.
Not only correctness, but rightness, right? So not only is it correct, it is also right, which means that anything that is not like mine is wrong, or we start to add moral judgments to those things. And so when I look at this image in this picture, it really strikes me to ask some deeper questions. So how did one person get to learn that it is a 6 and the other person learned that it was a 9? How did they come to that? What are some methods that they might...
Their culture.
So it could be their culture that they grew up in?
Experiences. I still think that's a part of it. What you experience.
So their personal
influences.
experiences and influences. Mm-hmm. All right. How else?
You know, their role models in life, like who they looked up to, who they obtained advice from along the years.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know for me, there are ways that I see today, and I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier, that are directly impacted by my parents, right? By the people who taught me, the people who helped raise me. And so I would say that these individuals are very much in that same mold, right? Has anyone ever received a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy? Anyone?
What do you mean?
You know, you make a copy. So when I was in college.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah,
right.
It's all fragmented. It looks bad.
Yeah, it gets pretty blurry.
Yeah, it gets blurry. It's fragmented. It's bad. And that copy that you've received does not look like the original, right? Like in the textbook, it looks really good in the textbooks, but after you've copied your friend's copy, it doesn't look so good. And I would say the same thing happens for us. So as people have given us their worldview, where did they get their worldview from?
Yeah, I mean, just where they happen to be standing, right? So just like these people, they showed up, they happen to be standing at opposite ends. You don't get to choose where you were, what you were born into, and what culture and all of that shapes what you're seeing. I love this image because even as the viewer, you're seeing something different.
You're right. And so, the people who have told them that this is a 6, or the people that have told them this was a 9, where did they get their information from? Probably from other people who said that this is a 6 and that this is a 9. And where did those people get their information? Probably from others. And so one of the things we have to recognize is that we don't see the truth. We only see parts of the truth, right? We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And so if I want to see the world differently, where does change have to start?
With me.
With me.
With me.
I'm talking about the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to make a change.
Somebody please mute his mic.
Yeah, you guys can see me dancing over here, so at any rate, so how do we start making that change? And so part of that change is a cognitive change. So we have to change how we think, how we see the world, how we see ourselves in the world. And so what I'd like to present to you is as a model for really kind of trying to balance that stuff out. So, and this is an older model. There are newer models of this that you might find in like the Intercultural Development Inventory or the IDI. I'm not sure if you've had experience with that. I think it's a great tool. I prefer this, the source material a little more, and you'll see why in just a second. So there are, so I also believe that human behavior is on a spectrum, right? So we're not either or. We're not on or off, but we're actually on a spectrum of behavior. If I talk too much, that's a bad thing. If I talk too little, that also is a bad thing, right? So somewhere between talking too little and talking too much, I have to find the behavior that works for me in accordance to my goals. But we'll talk about goal achievement in just a second. And so what I'd like to just offer you is that there's being ethnocentric, which is my ethnicity or my culture is the center of all things, the things that others should be defined by. And then there's ethno-relative, that I can compare my culture alongside other cultures. And you'll see the themes of this going through the rest of this particular chart. So homogeneous cultures, and then on the other end is heterogeneous cultures, right? So homogeneous cultures mean groups, means that everybody is the same, where heterogeneous groups means that people are different. Monocultural cultures where everyone, again, is the same, and then intercultural means that there is variation and differences alongside. And so what we recognize on this ethnocentric end of the spectrum or continuum is that denial, defense, and minimization are the hallmarks of this kind of isolation or polarized way of thinking or being, where acceptance, adaptation, and integration is on the other end, and typically helps us get more towards our goals, right? And so when we think about integration, one thing I do want to recognize is that I believe that we have been using or trying to use integration in a poor way. I don't think we've done it effectively, right? So when we talk about integration, how have we seen integration play out in our social systems? What does integration look like in our social systems?
Andre, this is Jeff Krogan. So
Yes.
I grew up in the Milwaukee area, and my generation was one of the first ones. I'm not sure how familiar you are with anything that's happened in Milwaukee over the last couple decades. We essentially, there was a program, and I came from at the time, 99.9% white community. I was in a suburb of Milwaukee. One of the things that occurred in the early 90s that some of the people on the call may remember was a busing program called I think it was the 220 program, where it brought students from the inner city who were African-American, Black, into the suburban high schools. It was the first interaction a lot of us had ever had with anyone who is not white. It was interesting, very different. I realize now a lot of the things that I learned and a lot of the things I didn't learn all the way back in the day. I'm still really good friends with a lot of people that I met from that program, but it's still a completely different, like there's two different worlds, even when I interact with those individuals today. Go ahead.
So I was just going to ask, where did integration fall short? Because that you were a part of something that was referred to as an integration program, but where did it fall short?
My take on it now, holy cow, this is what, almost 30 years gone by. I think it was more of a, I hate to use this term, but the quote unquote savior design, where we're helping these students, which is terrible even that I say it that way right now, because it implies that they would not have gotten a good enough education where they were.
Right.
And
go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah. Let me step back. One thing that I think happened that was amazing out of it, and all the things that went wrong with it, one of the things I think that was amazing out of it was that the kids, the students, we just adapted to life with each other. I mean, we didn't have, as I say this, I do not recall it occurring. I'm sure it did, but I don't remember racist activity occurring the way it would have historically been labeled, right? You weren't seeing students, as far as I was aware, going around and using racial terms against each other. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say it didn't happen, but for the most part, the students learned to get along.
Yeah.
But I think it was because it was only for that short period of time, as opposed to I'm not living my life with these people. we're spending time together, as opposed to trying to figure out how to get along as a society.
It's so interesting you bring up that example, Jeff, because my family, I'm African American, my husband is Jamaican, and we live in Shorewood. And I didn't know that was a weird thing for a family of color to do in the Wisconsin area. But when we interacted with the schools quite a bit, they thought that my child was a Chapter 220 child. Like, oh, so did they miss their bus today? And I'm just like, I don't understand what you're saying. So those things that were prevalent, 20 some odd years ago, they still persist today. And Chapter 220 students are treated different than other students. Yeah. They don't have access to the same things because they're after school programs or something else where they just don't have access to that same level of education. But it's really interesting that you're looking at it from that side, and then I'm looking at it from, wait, what's going on? Because when I grew up in Detroit, some of the best schools in the Detroit area were predominantly minority schools. And so when I came to Wisconsin, it was a very big shift for me when you didn't see that same level of attention in our African American communities. It felt like those communities that were left behind a lot. It was just a much more drastic shift. People in leadership didn't look like the people in the community. It was just very odd for me. But anyway, I'm gonna get off.
So I have some imagery, right? So this is integration. You tell me what the problem is. So this is integration. So what's the problem with that model that I just presented, where I have I have my fingers already here, and then I bring these other fingers to interlock with these? What's the challenge with that?
You're assuming it's going to work. You're assuming. Go ahead.
So,
And you have a pre-existing condition that you're trying
Right.
to add to instead of making an entirely new condition together.
Exactly. A new model. Yeah.
a new model, right? So one of the things, so in conflict resolution, and this, I'm still on the same, I'm still in the same vein. So I don't want you to think I jumped tracks. I'm circling back, right? So one of the things in conflict resolution that people say that we should always be striving for, I actually think is hooey. I think it's a bunch of malarkey when they say this. But what in conflict resolution, what should we be striving for? What's the pinnacle of conflict resolution?
Compromise.
Compromise. Compromise. Compromise is hooey. Why might I say that? Why might you say that, Andre? So I'll answer you, Andre. Because what is the presupposition of a compromise?
That you're both giving something up.
That you're both giving up something. You're both giving something up. That is what?
Value.
Of what kind of value?
Shared.
Personal value.
Equal value, right?
Equal value.
So we're assuming that the presupposition is that we assume that we are giving up something of equal value to be in this contract, relationship, whatever, however you want to talk about that, right? But what happens when one of the parties doesn't think that this was a fair or equal exchange?
No deal.
Resentment.
The commitment won't be there as great because they feel like you didn't give up as much as they did. So they come into it with a bias already. Already, yeah.
And so what I suggest is that in every compromise is a seed of resentment that is waiting to be watered by offense. Right? So Andre, if you're not saying, if you're saying that compromise is bad, how should we be navigating conflict? The same way we should be looking at integration. So the way we've done integration is that we have one group and we're going to bring everybody over to this group and then they'll be together. Yeah. And we end up with situations like Madison versus Milwaukee on election day. How is it that Madison has 66 polling places and Milwaukee's got 5? How could anybody let that kind of thing happen, right? So what I'm suggesting is that we look at how do we build a third way of being, right? And so that third way becomes something that we built together, not something that I have to give up something and you have to, and that's how we've treated integration. So integration is moving in and out of cultures because we're building a third way together. Star Trek: The Next Generation, and then I'll stop this because I want to hear your thoughts about how you can be helpful with building building things that allow ambiguity to have light on it, and we can move forward together. So I want to hear some of those things, but I want to tell this last story, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So I remember on Star Trek: The Next Generation, one of my favorite shows, there was this there was this ambassador that was going, they sent him to a war-torn planet. And so the planet is at war, at civil war, and is ripping itself apart. And the Federation is concerned about this because it could leap to other planets and so forth and so on. So they send one of their best ambassadors. Now this ambassador was deaf. He could not hear. So he used, he was also a telepath. And so he had a telepathic link with 3 other people that he called his chorus. So that was his group of people. And so he goes to do the ambassador thing. Some mishap happens and his chorus is destroyed. And so now the Federation's like, we're going to pull this guy. This is not a safe situation. Let's just call this quits, and then we'll just let the planet destroy itself. And, but the ambassador was like, no, I need to do this. And he was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to figure it out. And so one of the things that he did was he looked at the situation, and these people were diametrically opposed in every aspect, right? To you and I, they looked exactly the same, but to each other, they were diametrically opposed. And so what he ended up saying was, I know how to fix this. And so what he did was he taught them American Sign Language. So they had a way to communicate with him that was a third way of being. Paulo Freire talks about this in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If you ever get a chance to look it up, do so. But he really talks about the thing that the oppressor fears most is being the oppressed. And oftentimes liberation for the oppressed, liberation looks like oppression to folks. So they continue this cycle of the top and bottom, and they keep circulating these things. When what Paulo Freire suggests, which is what I'm suggesting, is that we come with a third way of being. So how do we get rid of ambiguity? How do we get rid of fear? How do we get rid of all of these things? First, we must back up into our values. And so on the screen there, you see the set of Mayo values, and that's what we've been using as a tool to kind of talk about this ambiguity and talk about the fear, because when we if we stay true to our values and to our mission, then I may have fear, but I have something to hold on to. Right? I have my principles. At Mayo, we say that the needs of the patient come first. And so for that to happen, we have to stay connected to our values, to our principles, stay true to who we are, right? So, so there's that. And so the rest of these are resources that folks can think about. So be a sponsor for someone, be a champion for someone, and be an upstander, right? So there are plenty of opportunities to walk away, but how many times, or what does it take? How do you prepare to be able to stand up for other folks? So I want to open the floor for conversations, thoughts, observations. Yeah, let me just stop talking.
Andre, can you go back a couple slides? I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I think go that one right there. What's your take on the realization that people can be at the same individual can be at multiple points? If you look at the top blue colored boxes, they could be at the same person could be at multiple points in that spectrum, if you want to call it that.
Yes.
Depending on the topic or the group that you're speaking about.
Correct. And context, right? So depending on the context, we could be all over the place. I think, so part of the reason that I like to show this or to is so that people can come to the conclusion that you have just come to, that you can be in a number of these places all at the same time, but to also take out the guilt, shame, and blame that oftentimes can come with not knowing what to do or feeling that I'm in one of these places and that it's a wrong or bad place to be, when in fact it's just a developmental place, right? So being 5 years old is not bad. It is a place of development. Being 50 years old is not bad. It is a place of development, right? And so, so I think that that's helpful. Did you have another thought about that?
No, I think I've been looking at it, and I've seen something similar to this before, and I kind of look at it as generational differences. My parents grew up in a completely different time frame and a completely different world than where we are today. But it's interesting because I see the changes in my mom, who's my only remaining parent left, as, I want to say, a result of her kids living their own lives. Like the changes that the kids have brought forward, I can see a change in her generation, but I definitely see that it's where its limitations are. There are societal things that that generation can, and I sadly feel won't accept. But at the same time, I just don't know if they're able to comprehend it even. So it's a matter of how much. My question for the group is, how far can you move the ball when you have it, so to speak? And where do you want to take it today?
So this is Tani. I think I was having that same frame of thought, but it was coming to me differently. So Andre, for example, when you said you're in this space, this is how you feel, you're not necessarily wrong, but that's where you are. You're in development, like that's your development stage that you're in. So then if you're at a age 5 development stage, what is the interrupter to that? You know,
To break you out of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
What is the interrupter? How do you help someone advance to age 6 and beyond?
He's dancing again.
You can't.
Yeah.
They have to want to.
Can I share my interruption?
Yes, please.
An interrupter for me, personally, and I don't know if I've shared this with anybody on the call, but when I was in college, so I married my college sweetheart. Yay. So when I was in college, I was kind of the head of our Bible study. Like I was that girl, like Bible thumping all over the place, putting up posters, everything, loving every moment of it. And there was like a program that went on, and people put up flyers around the building, and it said, wear your jeans on Friday, you know, support your students. Friday came, everybody's wearing jeans, and then they put up a poster, thank you for supporting your LGBTQ community. At that time, I was at age 2, probably, in terms of maturity. And I did not understand. I was like, why would they just come sideways and all types of things, right? And so I put up other scriptures that kind of combated that, right? Probably 4 months later, I was pregnant. Mary was pregnant. That's pretty much what they called me in my family. How did Mary get pregnant? Where did this guy come from? And it was my interrupter. It changed my life. And it brought to light a part of me and a part of people that I hadn't seen before. I hadn't seen the pain I had inflicted on people before. I just didn't see it. And it wasn't because I didn't want to see it. I just didn't see it. And now it's hard for me not to see it. And that interrupted me personally to be like, that is not okay. Where you were was not an okay place, even though I didn't realize it when I was in it.
Yeah, but I'll cut you some slack. That's where you were, right? So that's where you were. The thing I like for you to, you know, all of you to really think about is that it's the goal that determines where you need growth. I'm going to say something that's controversial, and I don't make apologies, but I just want to warn, it's a trigger warning. People are allowed to be bigots. They're allowed to have whatever emotional thing that they want to have. They are allowed to be racist. They're allowed to be that way. But they can't act on those things, right? Because there are social penalties for those things. I say that to say that if a person is getting their goals met through using bigotry, there's nothing I can say to them that will ever change the fact that they use that as a tool. However, if we're able to help people see, and it's a lot like fishing. I don't know if anybody's gone fishing. Do you command fish to jump into your boat? No, you give the fish what it likes, and then it will get on the hook and you can catch it. So it really is about being goal-centered. So if I have a person who's at level 2, there are some folks who've never gone past level 2 because that's working for them. It's when we start looking at our goals differently, when we start recognizing that there's a discrepancy between my goal and my behavior. And the wider that gap, the more chaos, the more ambiguity, the more unsecure I am, even in my own identity. But the closer I pull those things together, the more rational thought, the more I'd even say sanity I have when my intentions and my behaviors are and my goals are all in alignment together, right? So yeah, no, so we can be all over this place. It's not where where you start is important too, but it's actually what you do with the time that you have, right? What you do with the time that you have.
Yeah,
Questions, comments? Yeah.
I think what kind of makes this difficult from a diversity.
Can I just pop in 1 second?
Yeah.
I know we're over a bit, so if anyone needs to jump off, please jump off. Don't feel bad about it. If Andre, you can stay and keep talking, let's keep talking.
From a diversity and inclusion standpoint, and now we're trying to make this become diversity way, right? And I think that's what makes this difficult, in that when we had our focus groups that we just got over that all of March, and we could see that based on the group of people that were in the room and speaking with us at that time, you could see the way they responded to their interpretation of diversity and inclusion, and you could actually understand based on different qualities, whether they were all Caucasian in one room or it was a mix of Caucasian and African American or some other group. We could see all of that, right? My thing is, if we're other than education and training that we're trying to put forth in this group, knowing that people are going to, as you say, they may be okay with being where they are, right? How do we somehow get them to see diversity and inclusion as this is what we're trying to make come across all diversity, and this is what we want across it, and without inflicting something that they don't necessarily want, you know?
So I like working at Mayo Clinic. For me to stay working at Mayo Clinic, I got to do what Mayo Clinic wants me to do.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, I had a supervisor once who, I got too friendly with the supervisor. And I told the supervisor, supervisor, I don't want to do this. You're asking me to do something. I don't want to do that. And the supervisor said, that's great. I understand where you're coming from. But I just want to let you know that I need someone in your position
right.
to do this thing.
Right.
And I said, you know what? I'm going to do this. That you had a good idea for me to do this thing, right? No. So I mean, so there's certain types of behaviors that we just, you have a choice. This is where we're going. Right. And if if you can't, don't want to, you have a choice.
Right.
You know, and I think a lot of organizations don't take that stance, and so they end up with merely wishy-washy stuff. It is so funny. So I'll just give you a little bit of behind the curtain at Mayo Clinic, right? People there love Mayo. Even in our little private conversations, you hardly find anybody that's going to say anything negative about Mayo because they love it. But I told them, I said, when I first got there, I said, but y'all treat Mayo Clinic like your grandmother's old furniture. Anybody have grandmothers or grandfathers that had the plastic on the furniture, right? People, you sit on that stuff and it's not comfortable.
Right.
But it looked good. Right.
Right.
So a lot of times organizations, it would get back to your point, aren't really clear about this is what it takes for us to be successful, and this is how we're going to move, and you have choices, right? At Mayo, I told them, I said, you know, maybe it's time to take off the plastic off the furniture so we can get real about some of our uncomfortableness, right? And actually enjoy the sofa. But that's
I like that response.
That's something, yeah.
So can I ask if you have any advice, right, for us something that really spoke to me was when you're talking about that power dynamic, right? And I think that, you know, the way I was raised, right, that's something that's very common in even my family, right? Is just, well, if I compromise, if I move, then it's going to flip on me. And I don't want, so I'm going to maintain my position. And I think a lot of the things that we as a country have done, like, sorry, that's my 2-year-old, you get to meet her.
We know what time it is.
Yeah, right. But you know, as if I give up something, you know, I'm giving up something, right? That was rightfully mine, right? It's sort of the mentality, right? And so how do we help with that, right? Because I think that there's a lot of fear associated with that, and I worry, even as we do the diversity and inclusion initiatives in Versity, right, that we're not asking anybody to give up the position where they're standing, but I think for the, you know, Caucasians, right, this is, you know, our country. You hear all this rhetoric, right, and nobody's ever asked, hey, you need to move, right? And I think my generation might be starting to do that a little bit now, right? But I think sort of to I can't remember if it was Sean that made the point, right? Yeah. But how do we soften that and make it so that people see it as you're not giving up anything, you are just allowing people to come stand where you're standing.
Okay, so no, great point. So this is what I would ask. So first of all, do any of you have a doormat in front of your door?
Yeah.
Right? So you'll hear people say goofy stuff like, don't be a doormat. Don't let people walk all over you. What's the purpose of a doormat, first of all?
To be walked on?
To be walked on. So that what?
So you can clean your shoes?
So your shoes, so when you walk on that mat, so that when you go into the house, your shoes are cleaner than they were before you walked on the mat, right? So doormats have a reason, because people don't let people walk all up. No, for some of us that's okay, right? The other thing is really asking this question: is it better to be right or to be effective? Is it better to be right or to be effective? So in my case, in a lot of my intimate partner relationships, in my early days, I was right at all costs. And what do you think being right costs me?
Being happy.
Sometimes being happy, but ultimately those relationships. Yeah, those relationships were destroyed because I'm gonna be right. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do I become effective? And so, you know, I'm not asking anybody to give up stuff, because it psychologically people can't. You know, a lot of a lot of white people are really having a hard time with diversity because what they hear when somebody, yes, 2030, the majority of the minority majority is going to happen in 2030, 2050. What they hear is there's less of me. I'm being diminished. They're taking stuff from me. When that's not necessarily the truth, because you're just not having babies at the same rate as everybody. But
well, why does it matter? Like, that's what it's amazing to me. Why does it matter?
Right.
Let's keep the score.
That brings up an interesting point. Like, oh no, I'm going to be a minority. People are going to treat me the way that I treat minorities.
And that's what Paulo Freire is talking about, right? It's this interesting cyclical thing. And their biggest fear is that people will treat me the way I treated them, which is not necessarily true, right? But that ambiguity keeps people fueling. So I'm always about being goal directed. And are your behaviors allowing you to achieve your goal? And if they are, there's nothing I can do to help you. But if they're not, then we can negotiate, we can talk, we can manage, we can coach, we can lead people to behaviors that are congruent with not only their intentions, but their goals. And so that's what I would suggest or coach people into, right? Being goal oriented.
All right, so for the sake of Andre's time, because I feel like he'll continue.
I will forever.
I know. Close it. I want to thank you so much for hosting this conversation. This was great. I didn't know where we were gonna go, so I was glad that you led us where you led us, and I hope we can do this again. I think this will be nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you so much, Andre.
Thank
you so much.
If you were here,
Thank
I'd give you a cup or a gift or something, but I'll just say thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I do, just so you know, I do birthday parties, bar mitzvahs, and funerals. So
somebody please mute them.
Yeah.
I'll invite you to some of my relatives' house.
You guys have a great day. Thank you so much.
All right, you too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.